Well, hello everyone. Today we're here to talk all things bonds and why you should consider bonds as part of your retirement income. Now, we always know we love to get an expert on the couch. Today is no different. We've got Philip, who is the head of research from FIIG Securities. Philip, welcome.
Thank you.
So I think that we need to kick off with the question that I had when I was researching this is, what exactly are bonds and how do they work?
Bonds are different from shares, and a bond is like lending money to a company. It's like a loan you make to a company, and so the company is required to give you back interest, normally each 6 months or each year, and then give you the exact same money back at the end. Bonds, the technical term for bonds is fixed income, which actually probably is a more descriptive name, but actually helps people a little bit more. So a bond is an investment where you get a specific amount each year and then get your money back at the end, which for people who are trying to design their retirement, knowing exactly what you can get in advance is obviously quite useful.
Absolutely. Now, you touched on shares there. You know, we know that our audience, they have quite a large share portfolio amongst themselves. So for someone who has a large share portfolio, how exactly do you know to balance your share portfolio with bonds? And, you know, should you be splitting it half and half? Should you move all your shares into bonds? What are your thoughts on that?
We would not suggest that you move all your shares into bonds. Concentration like that is rarely a good idea. And in fact, that's one of the reasons you should be thinking about buying bonds, is that Australians in particular, compared to investors all around the world, Australians just love to buy shares, which is great, except that when you buy a share, you're buying a small part of that company. So you have a pretty material risk as to whether that company is going to go up in price or down in price. You hope to receive a dividend, but the company has the right to change the dividend if it's not convenient for them, which when you're trying to fund your retirement is not what you're trying to achieve. So a balance between some shares and some bonds gives you a much better mix of investments. And that particularly as you're approaching retirement and you want to actually sort of like live off the income you're creating, that is a key reason that why we recommend clients to have a mixed portfolio, which is some shares, some bonds, some property. The other interesting feature of bonds is, it's a technical term, so I apologize in advance, I'll explain it. It's a term called negative correlation. Now, your clients probably will understand that a correlation is when two things move together. A negative correlation is when two things move in opposite directions. Now, when people and investors are feeling confident, they buy shares and shares rise in price, bonds tend to fall in price. When people are scared and they're selling their shares because they're not quite sure what's going to happen, they want to go somewhere safe, they want to buy bonds, so bonds rise in price. What this means is that if you have a portfolio which is, say, 50% shares and 50% bonds, half your portfolio is always doing well. And that diversification is really beneficial. There's a trap that people who retire and then shortly after they retire, there's a big drop in the share market, can find that, I thought I had enough money, and then there's a 30% drop in share prices. Well, for those of you who've been keeping track, there was a bit of a disturbance earlier this week where the ASX sort of dropped 5% in a couple of days. Bonds rose 3% over those couple of days. So if you had a mixed portfolio across that period, you sort of rode through that volatility quite nicely. And that's what bonds bring to a portfolio.
Yep. Well, the next question was, what role do they play in a retiree portfolio? But I think you just answered that question. It gives a level of balance.
Yeah, it is those two things. It is the balance and diversification you get from having bonds and shares means that you'll always have part of your portfolio doing well. And the other thing they bring, as I said, is fixed income, is a clear view over what your payments, what your coupons are going to be over time, so that you can plan in advance.
You can plan the world cruise and
you
cruise around Australia.
You can stop off in Macau and which coupon will have landed the day before you get to there.
So what risks though? Because obviously every type of investment comes with some sort of risk. So what risks are associated with investing in bonds?
There are essentially three big risks that you need to be aware of. The first is actually inflation. Now, when I describe this as a fixed income, you're having a loan with a company, so you know for sure that they're going to give you back $100 in 5 years' time. How much is that $100 going to be worth in 5 years' time? Well, that depends on what inflation does. Now, the standard sorts of bonds have just straight nominal dollars. They pay you, $6 every year and then $100 at maturity, and you just got to hope that $100 is worth about $100. So the purchasing power can drop. Now, there are also, however, what are called inflation-linked bonds. So those sort of bonds they pay you a coupon each year, and then the $100 at the beginning, they index it to CPI, and they'll give you, it might be 110, might be 130, depends on what inflation does. So inflation is a big risk and one you have to be aware of. The second risk is interest rate risk. Now, most people will be aware the Reserve Bank has been raising rates, which...
It's been a ride.
Yeah. When you... This kind of... The best way to think about this, and most of your viewers would probably best think of it as the opposite of fixing your mortgage. When you fix a mortgage, what you're hoping for is that interest rates go up. So you are in a great position. You're paying less than the market rate. Bonds work the other way around because you're receiving the interest. If you go into a fixed investment and agree to receive $5 or 5%, $5 a year, and then the interest rate rises to 6, all of a sudden you've got less than the best available. So the price of your bond will fall. Now, if you own that bond to maturity, that doesn't matter. But if you try and sell out of your bond in the middle of the investment, the price can move up and down depending on what interest rates have done. So that is one risk. Now, the way we control for that risk is generally to consider how long you want to invest for, or to have only short investments. If you've got a 2 or 3 year investment and the interest rate moves, well, you get your money back in 2 years' time. It doesn't actually change so much. The final risk is from the issuer themselves. Now, bonds are very safe investments because they're guaranteed to give you the $100 unless the company defaults. Now, as a general rule, companies don't default. It's very, very rare. I think there's only been 3 instances in Australia of a investment grade rated bond defaulting in the last sort of 40 years, but it can happen. So you need to keep track of the creditworthiness of the company that you're lending money to. That's actually where my job comes in. Head of research at FIIG is to make sure we're paying close attention to those companies, to make sure that if anything starts to go wrong, we're aware of it as soon as it starts to happen.
I think that's the point as well of working with a company like FIIG Securities, is it takes the worry about you having, you're not managing it. You're having someone do, as you say, the research to make sure that they're ahead of the game to be managing your portfolio for you. So in terms of me using the word portfolio, I know that that's a way, we think about share portfolios. Is it the same with, is it a bond portfolio? Like in terms of, in terms of what the audience, to help them think about it, what does a bond portfolio look like?
Well, this depends greatly on how you want to do your bond portfolio. It is true as a portfolio, you should have, in the same way in the share market, you should have at least half a dozen and probably more like 10 to 15 different companies, different investments. Exactly the same in a bond portfolio. You do also need to stop and consider what type of bonds are in your portfolio. So we discussed fixed rate bonds and then inflation-linked bonds. There's also another sort called floating rate bonds, where they move up and down with the cash rate. It's not strictly speaking the cash rate, but it's very close to the cash rate. So that portfolio does need to be designed. Now, the relationship managers at FIIG will help you do that, but there's actually different ways to design your portfolio. FIIG offers what's called direct bond investment, where a relationship manager sits down with a client and we design a bespoke portfolio for you, which is great. It means you get exactly what you need. The slight drawback is that you need to monitor it carefully, and that you will need to change it over time because well, this bond's matured. You'll need to buy a replacement bond. The other way of going about this is to buy sort of like a ready-made portfolio. Well, for the moment, we have one bond fund, which is investing in a general selection of Australian bonds, trying to mimic the Australian Bond Index, the same way that the All Ordinaries and the ASX 200 mimic the Australian share market. The other way of doing that is we are actually shortly going to launch a new bond, which is called the Income Fund, monthly income fund, which is buying bonds which are designed to give you strong, predictable monthly cash flows.
Okay.
And so if you invest in that fund, it's like investing in a share fund, except that it's bonds. You buy it once at the beginning, and we take care of choosing the bonds, recycling the money when a bond matures, selecting the right bonds, selecting a good mix of bonds, and you get to sit back and have, well, in the case of the monthly income fund, monthly income.
Yep. So shares are usually a long play. Is it the same with bonds? Does it matter where someone is in their retirement journey as to whether or not they're coming into retirement, whether they've just retired or whether they've been retired for 20 years? Is there a sort of any advice in that regard as to whether or not there's a preferred period of time of someone's life to come and talk to FIIG about getting a bond portfolio going?
I would suggest that so essentially every investor should have some amount of bonds. The general rule of thumb is that the bonds will give you, over a long period, slightly less return than equities and much more stability.
Right.
So if you already have a large sum of money that is like sufficient for you and you want to protect it, that's when you need bonds to protect it, because you will...
Security.
It's like shares.
Yeah.
If you buy a bond, it will never double overnight. I won't lie, it's never going to happen. A bond will never double overnight, but also it is very, very rare for bonds to drop by 60% overnight. And a bond portfolio will not do that. A well-designed bond portfolio will not drop by 30 or 40% the same way that the share market would. So as a general rule, as you get older and you have you're closer to your final target values, that's when you start saying, well, no, I want to protect this more, use my capital to draw income rather than having it at risk in the share market. So for younger people, small amount of bonds as you're going through. As you get towards retirement, you're talking maybe sort of 30 or so percent of your portfolio. And then as you move through retirement, 40 to 50% of your portfolio, those sort of numbers. And obviously that's a general rule of thumb. It's not specific for any exact
but
person,
it's super interesting to kind of, I guess, just, view things through a different lens and sort of have an idea of what it might look like. So I still think that's really valuable. So Philip, maybe you can recap the role of bonds in retirement for our audience.
The single best things that bonds provide to investors is that protection of their capital, so that you know that you're going to get your money back at the end. And over the course of the investment, they're paying you predictable income every month, every quarter, every year. So you know precisely what you're going to get. You can live off that money. You can plan to live off that money whilst knowing that the capital at the end is also safe.
Thank you so much for your time today. I know I've learned a lot. I hopefully think that everyone in the audience has learned a lot as well. And I think that one of the key messages that came out for me, certainly when you sit and talk to someone like yourself as an expert, it really is about going and getting advice from someone who knows what they're doing, right?
Well, our tagline at FIIG is we're the fixed income experts. This is what we do. We don't do shares at all. We do fixed income because that's what we know.
Perfect. Thank you so much for your time today, Philip.
Thank you.